There's no surprise today. Again, we say this many times, and especially the whole world is standing at the crossroads when we talk about this geopolitical changes. On one hand, throughout the social media, we're seeing the messages almost screaming at us and wanted to know how can we restore the sanity and also the stability of the international order. But on the other hand, it's perfectly understandable that we say because today we do have a lot of unconventional players. It's not just about the economic agenda, it's not about these cultural barriers, it's more about the prediction for the future. When we look at the social media posts or throughout the media reports, of course, the war between US and Iran at this moment is still caught in the middle. And despite the ceasefire and also, of course, the mutual agreement, we don't even know if the Trump administration is confident enough to handle the rest of the pieces. And also, what about the aftermath of this agreement? But let's bring our attention to another matter, which is something rather crucial. And what about the war in Ukraine? And some argue, especially within the international community, that President Trump cannot afford to put this matter on the back burner. And keep in mind, people are still dying every day at the front line, especially we're seeing the cruelty and the insanity of the war and came out of Russia. But on the other hand, people are saying, hey, it's time for Donald Trump to put a focus back on this tension because it's time for Donald Trump to really reconsider the foreign policy way before the midterm election. And hopefully that the answer shall be revealed soon. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished guest, Dr. Alexander Moltó. Dr. Moltó is a historian and a political scientist, and he's the expert on Russia, Soviet Union, and Ukraine. And also, of course, he published many books and articles around the world. Well, Dr. Moltó, and welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Will, and thanks to your audience for listening.
Well, absolutely, Dr. Moltó. Again, it's one of the crucial topics that we have to talk about today. But let's bring something more fundamental to all of us. As we know, the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump paid a short visit to France to attend the G7 summit. And not only that, there were a couple disputes and disagreements took place regarding the war between U.S. and Iran. And there's no surprise that Ukraine's current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, also paid a visit at the summit and strongly encouraged the European leaders continue to support Ukraine in the midst of the whole chaos. Dr. Moltó, at this moment, as I mentioned in the intro, President Trump has dealt with the war between US and Iran for a while. But right now, is it time for him to continue to pay closer attention to the war in Ukraine? Because right now, at this moment, as I mentioned, people are still dying on the front line, but it doesn't seem like President Trump has a tangible or practical strategy really to offer on the table, because this is something that he cannot get away or will not get away before the midterm election. Your thoughts?
Trump is in trouble. He's started a war in Iran, which, according to most analysts, he has lost. It's been a humiliating defeat for the United States. It's been an even more humiliating defeat for President Trump. And he's now in the position of trying to salvage what remains of his reputation. The reason I start by talking about the Iran catastrophe, the debacle, the humiliation, is that Trump needs something resembling a victory, a foreign policy victory, a domestic policy victory. Things aren't working out all that way at home either. And in that sense, if he were to refocus his attention on the Russian-Ukrainian war, he could attain a significant victory. Now, will he do this? I don't know. But this would be an ideal opportunity for him to try something like this, because the war in Iran is going badly, will go badly, and whenever it ends completely, it will be viewed as a major strategic defeat for the United States and for Trump. In contrast, Ukraine is winning the war in Ukraine. That's the broad consensus amongst foreign policy, Ukraine, Russia experts. It's winning the war. It certainly has stopped the Russians. It's regaining some of its territory. And it's now on the verge of isolating Crimea from from Russian logistics and supplies. There are reliable reports by journalists that Russian officials are running away from Crimea. They've already started evacuating their families. Now they're in the process of trying to evacuate their treasures, their goods. That's a clear sign of panic. And it's panic that is motivated by the fact that the Ukrainians are in the process of isolating and surrounding Crimea. Trump is now in the position of helping Ukraine decisively. If he were to do that politically, diplomatically, and of course militarily and economically, Ukraine's victory could be a matter of months as opposed to years. And he would be considered responsible, or at least co-responsible, for this victory. He could then present this to the world and to his voters, to his supporters, as a victory and a vindication of his foreign policy. And attention would shift from the debacle in Iran to the victory in Ukraine. So Trump stands before a very important decision for himself. It's obviously an important decision for Ukraine and Russia. It's obviously an important decision for Europe, China, and everybody else. But most importantly, because after all, we know quite well that most of his decisions are made on the basis of their effect on him personally. So we know that if he were to make the right decision at this point in time, that could have an incredibly important impact on him, his popularity, on the chances of the Republicans in the midterm elections. Now, will he see that? Will he recognize that? It's not clear. During the G7 meeting, he said, Ukraine is far away. It doesn't concern the United States. We will continue providing weapons for the Europeans to buy. That's not quite what will save his reputation. He needs to come out and declare explicitly that Ukraine must win, will win, and that he is going to oversee that process. But thus far, as I said, his response has been less than lukewarm.
Well, again, Dr. Molto, it looks like Trump has dealt with the issue, what we called the commitment. You know, it's one thing that we listen to the rhetoric, but again, for the sitting for the Ukrainian President Zelensky, that he anticipated some sort of confirmation from the Trump administration, but somehow that administration failed to do so. But let's talk about another piece. During the G7 summit, some of the European nations have conveyed the idea that they were willing to engage with Moscow in negotiation, while also warning the new Russia sanctions and sending military aid to Ukraine. On another piece, that since U.S.-led negotiation to end the Ukraine war failed by the wayside in recent months, President Zelensky has been pushing to revive talks with a more prominent role for his European backers, for example, France, Germany, and Britain. We know, Dr. Molto, in reality, that Trump has been complaining about the roles of the European countries when we talk about the war in Ukraine. But on the other hand, correct me if I'm wrong, it looks like President Zelensky has already shifted his trust or his faith from US to the European leaders. So now at this moment, when we look at some of the big players, the France, Germany, and Britain, I guess I am so dumb, but I still want to ask the question, Professor Moto. How much responsibility that is for France, for Germany and Britain start to take bold steps in terms of negotiation, even possible talks with Moscow. So that's number one. And number two, why do you think, or how do you think that France, Germany, and Britain can be even more effective when we talk about the war in Ukraine? So in other words, does President Zelensky place the troops in those three countries? Is that a dare move, or this has to be the last resort? Your thoughts?
It's actually a very clever move, and it's the appropriate move at this point in time. For starters, Trump basically declared that he's not interested in Ukraine. And as you know from his several encounters with Zelensky going back to 2025, he wasn't just indifferent. He was actually very critical of Ukraine. He accused it of starting the war. He called Zelensky a salesman who has no cards. I mean, he was insulting. And at the same time, the United States has completely cut off all of its assistance to Ukraine, military and economic. Now, it's continued to provide weapons to the Europeans who then give it to Ukraine, so it's not quite a disaster. But essentially, over the last year and a half, Trump has shown that he does not support Ukraine. And as a number of very prominent analysts have argued, that he's also shown that he actually supports Vladimir Putin in Russia. Now, that's point one. So in a way, Zelensky has no choice but to turn toward the Europeans. That having been said, it's important to realize that the advances Ukraine has made on the battlefield, its ability to stop the Russian advance, to push back in certain areas, to produce an enormous number of casualties. As you know, Russia has lost something like 1.3 million soldiers, and of that number, something like 500,000, possibly even more, have been killed. The usual ratio is 1 killed to 3 wounded. In this particular case, it seems to be 1 killed to 1.5 wounded, which is a staggering sum. In any case, all of the progress that Ukraine has made toward what I've called victory just a few minutes ago has taken place without American support. Indeed, it's taken place with Trump's opposition to Ukraine and with his support of Russia. It's taken place with the assistance and support of the Europeans, which means, in other words, that as far as the Europeans and Ukraine are concerned, they don't need Trump or the United States as much as they needed them 1, 2, 3, 4 years ago. Now, the United States is still important, obviously, and it would be far better for Ukraine and the Europeans if the United States supported Ukraine and the Europeans. That said, they can do without Trump and they can do without Europe, without America. They're no longer indispensable. They're no longer critical to the success of Ukraine in the war. Again, if Trump were to be involved, he could produce a Ukrainian victory much more quickly, and the bloodshed and the death and the destruction, and that would all be to his credit, but we don't know. So turning towards the Europeans is not just necessary or imperative due to the fact that Trump has turned against Ukraine about a year ago, but it's also turned out to be the right move. That's produced, I think, it's produced these very positive consequences. The Europeans can do more. They're doing a lot. They're already raising their military budgets. They're providing military assistance. In the last few days, Denmark has pledged to give Ukraine I believe something like 10 to 20 F-16 fighter jets. So there is movement, and it's very significant, and it's helping Ukraine significantly. But there could be more. There could always be more. And one of the things that the Europeans can do and should do and are doing is to insist on their role in whatever negotiations take place regarding a ceasefire or peace. Trump purposely kept them out. He thought that he and his son-in-law and his friend, the real estate magnate Witkoff, would be able to come up with a deal. That, as you know, has turned out to be another catastrophe for the Trump administration. There is no deal, and there will be no deal as long as Kushner and Witkoff are in charge of these negotiations. I mean, these two men are real estate magnates. They have nothing to do with diplomacy. They're completely ignorant about Russia and Ukraine. To have them in charge of the negotiating process would be equivalent to me being in charge of their billions of dollars. I would lose the money within a day, since I have no expertise in the financial sector. The Europeans, however, do know Russia, they do know Ukraine, they understand the subtleties and the complexities of negotiations, and to have them involved would be significant. And to have them involved in negotiations with Russia would be very useful. I see nothing wrong with that. As long as the Europeans continue to support Ukraine, their involvement in starting possible negotiations with Russia can only be positive. And it looks like that may work, but obviously it all depends on Mr. Putin. As you know, Zelensky suggested to Putin that they meet immediately and sign an agreement regarding a ceasefire.
That's right.
Putin rejected that, but said that he would welcome Zelensky in Moscow, which was essentially an invitation for Zelensky to commit suicide. I mean, it's been standard Russian practice to invite opposition leaders to Moscow and then arrest them and kill them. So Zelensky would have to be suicidally crazy to accept that kind of invitation. But in any case, that's a different matter. But it just goes to show that Putin is the problem. And if the Europeans can in some ways contribute to inducing him to negotiate, and if the Americans were to contribute to Ukraine's victory, we could see the end of the war far more quickly than what it seems like at this point.
Dr. Moto, I have two more questions before letting you go. Again, you briefly talk about China. I remember a year ago when you and we had a conversation, I dared borrow a quote from the former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and he once said, America always knows how to make the best decision after exhausting all the possibilities. But today, when we are looking at, again, the complication of the geopolitics, and of course, our conversation solely centers on the war in Ukraine, let's talk about China. It was a surprise, but I have to say, it wasn't surprising to see President Trump paid a short visit to Beijing. And right after this visit, Vladimir Putin also paid a visit to Beijing. And then about a week ago, the sitting Chinese president made a short visit to Pyongyang, North Korea. Of course, right now, again, Dr. Moto, the international community is very concerned about this triangle relationships, regardless we put it in the political way or in this economic or however the interpretation could be. North Korea, China, Russia, and including Iran are the major top concerns for many countries. So I dare to ask Professor Moto, what role does China play at this moment when we look at the war in Ukraine? Of course, again, not only that both China and Russia, it's deeply tied in this BRICS, one of the major powerhouse to generate wealth and also influence from many levels. But on the other hand, how much can we believe that Trump's visit to Beijing at some point, of course, it was a closed-door meeting. We didn't know what topic were brought up. But at some point, the war in Ukraine had to come up. How believable is China today when we look at the chaos and when we look at the temperament of Trump? Your thoughts?
Well, China is playing a very smart game, Xi Jinping, more specifically. It's staying out of the mess. It's supporting Russia politically. There's some technological supplies that China is giving the Russians as well. But it's essentially standing on the sidelines and watching its primary ally, Russia, get defeated. And I think China, we've talked about this before, I think China wants to have a weak Russia as a partner. It just makes much more sense than to have a strong, unpredictable Russia as a partner. And what we've seen over the last few weeks is significant in the sense that it reinforces the notion that China is on the verge of exerting hegemony in the international sphere. So first, Trump goes to China, hat in hand, begging essentially for some kind of sweetheart deals, knowing that he's in a weakened position because of the catastrophic war in Iran. Then Putin goes to China, again, hat in hand, and the Chinese essentially say, sure, we support you and everything else, but, you need to make certain concessions and so on. And those two visits, I think, are symptomatic of the position that China currently finds itself in. The wild card is North Korea, as always. The North Korean leader is at best unpredictable, at worst perhaps mentally confused. He's been playing a sophisticated game of playing Russia against China and trying to provide himself with more wiggle room and more autonomy. And my guess is that when Xi Jinping went to North Korea, the goal was to tell the North Korean leader that he needs to behave a bit more, that he shouldn't forget who his primary supplier, who his primary ally is, namely China. China is in the position, like Trump, it could end the war in Ukraine tomorrow. Well, that might be an exaggeration because it sounds similar to what Trump said about ending the war in 24 days. But it could end the war fairly quickly. And Russia is China's vassal. Russia has to do what China insists that it does. And if the Chinese were to pressure Putin, he would have to give in. He would have to surrender to Chinese pressure. So the question is, do they want to end the war? Does Trump want to end the war? The logic of the situation is such that they could, as I said, and that they would benefit enormously in terms of prestige. China would be able to claim that it's a peacemaker. Not everybody agrees with that position, but it would be able to make that claim very persuasively. It would also establish itself as the leading hegemon in Eurasia. So the question is, why isn't it doing that? And the answer is, I don't know. I honestly don't know, because the logic of the situation suggests that it should. The answer may be that it's waiting for Russia to get battered, and then at some point when Russia is already very, very weakened by the war, the Chinese could then step in and far more easily persuade Putin to do what they believe he needs to do. That may be the reason. I don't think that the reason is that they expect the Russians to win, if only because at this point everybody is pretty much in agreement that Russia is losing and cannot win. And I would be shocked if the Chinese were so unsophisticated and ignorant, frankly, to think that Russia is in a winning position. So it may be due to the fact that they're waiting for the Russians to get battered even more. And then they could step in, save the day, perhaps persuade the Russians that they are now the indispensable partner, and so on.
Dr. Moto, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. Former official under the Biden administration lately started to comment more about global order. As a matter of fact, there are so many articles came out to believe that despite the chaos and the uncertainty that we're seeing today, America and also the European allies should not give up on global order. And as a matter of fact, America is designated, can restore the global order, again, regardless how or what Donald Trump can do and will do. But we know that today, when we look at America, when we look at China, two largest economies in the world, so much involved of the two powerhouse. So Dr. Moto, from your perspective, again, China has never came out to claim that the global order can be shaped or influenced by the Chinese government. But we know that to some extent, in reality, some countries believe that China could play a role. So the question to you is, when we look at the global order, when we look at the global sanity, how much do we believe there has to be, or there shall be, this partnership between US and China at this moment? It's not about a win-win situation. It's more about maintaining the balance between insanity and sanity. Your final thoughts.
Very good question. The last 2-3 years, especially since Trump and then the war with Ukraine have begun, have brought about a major shift in international relations. Russia is no longer a great power, and it won't be one for many years to come. Ukraine might turn out to be a very influential player in the international arena if, as I suggested, it wins the war. The United States is in very serious trouble, mostly due to President Trump, who seems to be determined to reduce its influence internationally and to turn it into a pariah that everybody dislikes and makes fun of, but also because of a variety of other structural issues relating to education, the economy, the society that go beyond Trump. China, of course, has its domestic problems. Its economy isn't growing as well as it should. It has demographic issues. But China seems to be in the position, despite the claims of its leaders that it wants a multipolar world. In effect, China is going to be faced with the following choice. It could conceivably become or at least promote a bipolar world, where its partner or adversary will be the United States. It won't be Russia, of course. It's too soon for the Europeans to play this role. They don't have the military might in order to do this. But it's conceivable that they could play a greater role in 5, 10, 20 years. In the meantime, China could either promote its role within the bipolar world, or, depending on how far the internal and external debacle within the United States continues, China could find itself playing a unipolar role. It might turn out to be the only great power that, for all its faults and problems domestically, is still a great power. Russia, as I said, will have fallen away. Brazil and India are still too weak, as is Nigeria and South Africa. Europe could eventually play that role, but not yet. And the United States, under Donald Trump, is shooting itself not only in one foot, but in both feet. That could be remedied. Trump could conceivably see the light and change his views. That seems highly unlikely. But it all depends on what happens, partly in midterms, but mostly in the next presidential elections. If an alternative to Trump emerges, a reasonable, sane alternative to Trump emerges, either within the Republican Party or within the Democratic Party, we could see a revival of American power. And that could then bring about a genuine bipolar world and preclude the possibility of China having a unipolar moment. But it's all dependent on what happens in the next few elections. And at this point in time, it's just a little too early to say with any certainty what the likely outcomes are going to be.
Of course, Dr. Molto, 100% agree with you. And we know that today, when we look at the intricacy of the political system and the structures, and it's hard to tell who's going to be the ultimate winner at this moment. But again, we hope that the war in Ukraine can be ended in a way that satisfied all the people, because we say this many times, it's not fair that we see people are dying in the front lines, and these lives are precious and equally important to all of us. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Molto. And again, Dr. Molto is a political scientist, and he's a historian, and he's a specialist in Russia, Soviet Union, and also Ukraine, and so many more. Well, Dr. Molto, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. And again, we really appreciate your effort and your insight, and would love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.